You are teaching people how to disrespect you right now. Not intentionally, not because you're weak, but because of small, ordinary things you do every day that quietly tell others how far they can go with you. And the most dangerous part is that you probably think you're just being reasonable, kind, or mature. I've spent most of my life listening to people talk about the same pain in different forms. A boss who talks over them, a parent who never takes them seriously, a partner who dismisses their feelings, a friend who crosses lines and acts like it's nothing. And almost every time, they ask the same question: how do I make them respect me? That question feels logical. It feels fair, but it's pointing in the wrong direction. Because the truth is, you cannot make anyone respect you. That's not how respect works. What you can do is stop doing the things that quietly invite disrespect into your life. And if this feels uncomfortable already, that's a good sign. I want you to stay with me until the end, because there is one sentence, a sentence you've probably said hundreds of times, that trains people to see you as someone who needs approval, permission, or validation before acting. I won't tell you that sentence yet, but once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. This isn't about becoming colder. It isn't about becoming aggressive. It's about realizing that respect isn't something you demand. It's something your behavior either supports or erodes, quietly, over time. And before you assume this is about other people, I need you to understand something about me first. Before we go any further, I need to be honest with you about what this is and what it isn't. I'm not here to motivate you. I'm not here to comfort you. I'm not going to tell you that everything is going to be okay if you just think positively or repeat the right words in front of a mirror. I've heard those promises for decades, and I've watched how little they change what actually happens in people's lives. I spent years listening to people behind closed doors, in moments where there was no audience and no performance. Different ages, different careers, different families, but the same patterns. And what I learned is this: most people don't need more encouragement. They need more honesty. They need someone willing to say the thing that doesn't feel good, because it's the thing that actually works. So if you're waiting for me to tell you that the people who disrespect you are just broken, insecure, or wrong, you may want to stop listening now. That story feels good, but it keeps you powerless. It keeps your attention focused outward, on people you cannot control, instead of on the few behaviors you actually can. I'm not saying this to judge you. I'm saying it because I've watched what happens when people finally stop protecting their own comfort and start telling themselves the truth. That's where change begins. And the first truth almost everyone resists sounds small, harmless, even, but it changes the entire balance of a relationship. Here's the first behavior I want you to look at closely. You explain yourself too much. You explain your decisions, your boundaries, your timing, your choices often to people who have no real authority over your life. And you probably do it without thinking, because it feels polite. It feels reasonable. It feels like the mature thing to do. But every time someone questions a decision you've already made and you respond with a long justification, something subtle happens. You send a message that your choices require approval, that they are open for debate, that if the explanation is good enough, maybe you're allowed to proceed. Psychology has shown again and again that excessive self-justification lowers perceived confidence and authority. But you don't need a study to understand this. Think about how you perceive someone who constantly explains themselves versus someone who doesn't. One feels grounded, the other feels uncertain, and people respond to that difference immediately, even if they can't articulate why. I've watched intelligent, capable adults turn simple conversations into courtroom defenses. They present evidence, they anticipate objections, they try to make their decisions impossible to challenge. And, ironically, that effort invites more challenges, not fewer. Because the explanation itself teaches the other person that questioning you is normal, expected, encouraged. This is where many people get confused. They think respect comes from being understood. It doesn't. Respect comes from clarity, from knowing where you stand, from recognizing that some decisions don't need to be defended to exist. And once this pattern is in place, it doesn't stay small. It spreads into every interaction until one day you realize you're exhausted, resentful, and wondering why no one takes you seriously anymore. Here's the first behavior I want you to look at honestly. You explain yourself too much, not because you're insecure, not because you're weak, but because somewhere along the way, you learned that being understood was safer than being firm. Every time someone questions a decision you've already made, and you respond by laying out your reasons, your logic, your evidence, something subtle happens. You turn a personal decision into a discussion. You shift the balance of the interaction without realizing it. The other person is no longer listening to understand you. They're listening to evaluate you. And the message underneath all that explaining is never what you intend it to be. What you think you're saying is, I'm being clear. What they hear is, my decision is open for approval. That's the part most people miss. I've listened to countless capable adults do this. They walk through every step of their thinking. They anticipate objections before they're even raised. They try to make their choices impossible to argue with. And ironically, the more they explain, the more resistance they get. Because the explanation itself teaches the other person that questioning is expected, that pushing back is allowed, that your boundary is flexible if challenged long enough. Psychology calls this excessive self-justification, and it's consistently linked to lower perceived authority. But you don't need research to see it. Think about how you instinctively respond to someone who constantly explains themselves versus someone who simply states a decision and stops. One feels settled, the other feels unsure. People react to that difference immediately. This doesn't mean you never explain anything. It means you stop explaining to people who haven't earned an explanation. Clarity is not cruelty. It's not cold. It's simply choosing not to negotiate your life with everyone who questions it. And once you start paying attention to this habit, you'll notice how often it appears. In families, at work, in friendships. It's small, it's constant. And over time, it erodes respect quietly until you're left wondering when it all started. I once worked with a woman in her 40s, a highly respected architect. Intelligent, articulate, successful by every external measure. And yet, every time her mother questioned her choices, how she raised her children, a decision she made at work, even how she spent her weekends, she reacted the same way. She explained carefully, thoughtfully. She laid out her reasoning, step by step, as if she were presenting a case in court. She believed that if she could just make her thinking clear enough, her mother would finally understand and stop questioning her. But that moment never came. The questions only increased. What she couldn't see was that the explaining itself had become the problem. Each explanation taught her mother that every decision was open for discussion, that nothing was final, that if she pushed long enough, she would get a response. The explanations trained the behavior she was trying to stop. I asked her to try something that felt almost unbearable. The next time her mother asked why she made a decision, she was to say one sentence, because I decided to, and then say nothing else. No evidence, no defense, no follow-up. She stared at me as if I'd suggested something reckless. She was convinced it would cause conflict, that it would sound rude, that it would damage the relationship. But she tried it anyway. When she called me 2 weeks later, she was crying, not because the relationship had fallen apart, but because something had shifted. Her mother was confused at first, then irritated, and then, for the first time she could remember, respectful. Nothing about her intelligence changed. Nothing about her values changed. Only her behavior did. She stopped inviting her mother into decisions that didn't belong to her, and without a single confrontation, the dynamic rearranged itself. This is how patterns break, not through arguments, not through convincing, but through quiet, consistent clarity. And once you see this happen, it becomes impossible to ignore how often the same pattern appears elsewhere in meetings, in friendships, in marriages, where the real issue was never disagreement, but access. The second behavior that quietly invites disrespect is harder to face because it goes against everything most of us were taught. You feel the need to respond immediately, to fill the silence, to correct the tone, to defend yourself before the moment gets uncomfortable. When someone says something dismissive or crosses a line, your body reacts before your mind does. Your heart speeds up, your thoughts race, and almost without thinking, you jump in, you explain, you argue, you clarify, you try to fix the moment. And in doing so, you give the other person exactly what they were looking for. Here's what most people don't understand. Silence is not weakness. Silence is not passive. Silence is a decision. Research has shown that people who respond instantly to provocation are perceived as more reactive and less authoritative than those who pause. But again, you don't need a study to feel this. You already know it intuitively. I once worked with a colleague who was constantly interrupted in meetings by a younger man who didn't take her seriously. She tried everything. She asserted herself. She joked. She pushed back politely. Nothing changed. The interruptions continued because each reaction fed the pattern. I suggested something that felt almost absurd. The next time he interrupted her, she was to stop talking. Not argue. Not correct him. Just stop and look at him. No words. No explanation. Just silence. She tried it. She stopped mid-sentence and held his gaze for a few seconds. She told me later the room went completely still. He stumbled over his words, trying to fill the space she had refused to fill for him. He never interrupted her again. What changed wasn't his personality. What changed was the dynamic. His behavior depended on her reaction. When she removed that reaction, the behavior had nowhere to land. This is the part people fear. Silence feels risky. It feels exposed. But sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to participate in a game that only works if you keep playing. This is where everything shifts, and it's the part almost everyone wants to skip. You have to be willing to lose the relationship. I know how extreme that sounds. I know the fear that sentence brings up. But without this willingness, nothing you've heard so far actually works. If you are not prepared to walk away from a relationship where you are consistently disrespected, you have already communicated something important, whether you realize it or not. You've told the other person that your need for connection is greater than your need for self-respect. They may never say this out loud. They may not even be fully conscious of it, but they feel it, and they act accordingly. I'm not talking about cutting people off at the first sign of disagreement. Conflict is normal. Discomfort is part of being close to someone. What I'm talking about is a pattern, a repeated dismissal, a chronic lack of regard, a line that keeps getting crossed because it keeps being moved. Real boundaries only work when they have weight behind them, and that weight comes from knowing, quietly, that you will not stay where you are not respected, not as a threat, not as a performance, but as a fact. This is where many people get stuck. They say they have boundaries, but they don't enforce them, or they enforce them once, then soften them out of fear. Fear of loneliness, fear of conflict, fear of being seen as difficult. Fear is understandable, but fear also teaches people how to treat you. When you are willing to lose a relationship, something strange happens. You stop negotiating your worth. You stop chasing approval. You stop explaining. And the people who can meet you at that level stay. The ones who can't slowly fall away. This is not about punishment. It's about alignment. And I didn't understand that until I learned it the hardest way possible. I learned this lesson in the most painful way possible, not as a professional, as a mother. For years, my relationship with my son was strained. He believed I was too critical of his wife, and he was right. I was. But when he tried to talk to me about it, I did what I had done my entire life. I defended myself. I explained my intentions. I justified my words. I told myself I was being honest, that I was helping, that he would understand if I could just make my reasoning clear enough. What I couldn't see then was that my explanations weren't protecting the relationship. They were protecting my pride. Each time he drew a line, I stepped over it and called it conversation. Each time he asked me to stop, I told myself I had a right to my opinion. And every time I chose to explain instead of listen, I taught him that his boundary didn't matter. One day, he stopped calling. That was 18 years ago. I have not heard his voice since. There was no dramatic argument, no final confrontation, just a line he drew and refused to move. And this time, I didn't get another chance to explain myself out of it. I tested the boundary, and I lost. I respect him for that, even as it breaks my heart. He was willing to lose the relationship with his own mother to protect his self-respect and his marriage. I wish I had understood then what I understand now. I wish I had known when to stop talking. This is the part people don't want to believe. Boundaries don't work because you explain them well. They work because you're willing to accept the cost of enforcing them. Sometimes that cost is silence. Sometimes it's distance. Sometimes it's permanent. I would do it differently now. I would apologize. I would change. But wisdom that arrives too late doesn't undo what's already gone. That's why I'm telling you this now, so you don't have to learn it the way I did. This is where most people keep looking in the wrong direction. They ask, how do I make them respect me? How do I get them to see my value? How do I convince them to treat me better? And every one of those questions gives away your power. You cannot control how another person sees you. You can't reach into their mind and adjust their opinion. You can't argue someone into valuing you, but you can control what you allow into your life. You can decide what behavior you stay present for and what behavior ends the interaction. That shift from managing their perception to managing your standards is where everything changes. I once worked with a woman who asked me how to stop her husband from dismissing her opinions. When I asked what happened when he did it, she said she argued. She explained, sometimes for hours. She believed that if she could just make her point clearly enough, he would finally listen. He didn't. I asked her to try something different. The next time he dismissed her, she was to stand up and leave the room. No announcement, no lecture, no explanation, just gone. She was horrified. She said it would make her look dramatic, immature, crazy. I told her it would make the behavior costly. The first time, he was stunned. The second time, he was angry. The third time, before he could dismiss her, he stopped himself. He thought before he spoke, not because she had changed his opinion of her, but because she had changed what she was willing to tolerate. This is the part that's easy to misunderstand. You're not trying to control anyone. You're not trying to punish them. You're simply withdrawing your presence from situations where respect is absent. Over time, people either adjust or they remove themselves. And either way, you stop bleeding energy trying to earn what should never have required convincing in the first place. This is the question almost no one wants to sit with for very long. Do you actually respect yourself? Not in theory, not in words, but in the choices you make when it costs you something. After decades of listening to people describe feeling dismissed, overlooked, and taken for granted, one pattern became impossible to ignore. People who genuinely respect themselves rarely stay in situations where disrespect is chronic. Not because disrespectful people don't exist, they absolutely do, but because self-respect quietly changes what you tolerate. People with real self-respect don't argue for years hoping someone will change. They don't keep explaining why the same behavior hurts them. They don't make excuses for patterns that drain them. They leave, or they create distance, or they remove their availability. And they do it without drama, without speeches, without needing permission. If you keep finding yourself in relationships where you're not taken seriously, I'm not going to tell you it's your fault. That would be simplistic and cruel. But I am going to ask you to look honestly at why you stay. There is always a reason. Fear of being alone, financial dependence, family pressure, the hope that things will get better if you just try a little harder. These reasons are real. They make sense. And they're also the chains that keep people in places where they slowly disappear. Self-respect isn't loud. It's not performative. It's a series of quiet decisions that say, I won't live like this anymore, even when walking away feels terrifying. This is where the work actually is, not in changing how others see you, but in noticing where your behavior contradicts your values, where you say you deserve respect, but keep choosing environments that deny it. And once you see that clearly, the question stops being abstract. It becomes painfully practical. What am I willing to lose in order to keep myself? Most people don't answer that question until something is already gone. Earlier, I told you there was one sentence, a simple, ordinary sentence, that quietly trains people to disrespect you. And now I want to name it, because once you hear it, you'll recognize how often it slips out of your mouth. It sounds like this. Let me explain. Every time you say those words to someone who has no real authority over your life, you give your power away just a little. You signal that your decision is negotiable, that it needs to be justified, that if your reasoning is good enough, maybe you're allowed to proceed. That sentence feels harmless. It isn't. The alternative is almost uncomfortably small. The next time someone questions a decision you've already made, how you spend your time, how you set a boundary, what you choose for yourself, try this instead. Say, I've decided. And then stop. Don't fill the silence. Don't soften it. Don't rush to make it easier for them. This is not about being rude. It's about being clear. Clarity doesn't invite debate. It invites adjustment. People may be confused at first. Some may be irritated. That's normal. What matters is what happens next. Watch how the dynamic shifts when your decisions stop sounding like proposals. You don't need to do this everywhere. You don't need to do it all at once. Just once is enough to feel the difference. Because respect rarely arrives in big, dramatic moments. It changes in small, quiet ones, right where you're standing.